just we could reflect where we are, because I want to finish off by saying where we should go and whether playing for time is a coherent option or not. I think it's worth remembering where we came from. This was an exercise in party management which went horrifically wrong. That's why we are where we are. Clearly David Cameron, who I assume was invited to offer his own reflections on the calling of a referendum, David Cameron didn't expect this. The DUP, it's worth remembering, who I think Frank called a hard Brexit party, I think the label's fair, but even the DUP, it's worth remembering, didn't expect the referendum to go the way that it did. I could name several people senior in the DUP who voted to remain. It's also worth remembering that 30% of the DUP's own base, and they know their support base very well, 30% of the DUP's own support base voted to remain. It's worth remembering as well that we've talked a lot this afternoon about how the binary divide has been exacerbated by what has happened in terms of Brexit in Northern Ireland. It didn't need to be that way. The Ulster Unionist Party moved to a Remain position. The DUP argue, if you read their manifestos since the Brexit referendum, the DUP say that they were no longer necessarily Eurosceptic at the time of Cameron's renegotiation, that they, and I quote them, would give it fair wind. They were beginning to offer to drop some of their long-standing Euroscepticism, which dates back years, and from the Pays Act, it was all a Catholic conspiracy type, a Catholic club conspiracy which disappeared without trace. And of course Sinn Féin changed its position on the EU in 1998 when they adopted critical engagement with the European Union. So the EU was winning the argument, and parties were accepting across the island of Ireland the logic of cooperation across borders within a European framework. That's the tragedy of all this, that the binary divide has been exacerbated by what happened. If you look at the voting figures in the Brexit referendum, they haven't changed much since. I'll come on to this so-called shift in support for United Ireland in a moment, but I did the 2017 and 2015 Northern Ireland General Election Survey. The 2017 one showed that opinion had changed little from John Garry's survey at Queen's of the 2016 referendum itself. If you look at the acuteness of the binary divide, it is grim reading. 89% of nationalists voted Remain. 88% of those identifying as Irish voted Remain, and 85% of Catholics voted to Remain. So whichever binary you use, it's stark. Against 35% of Unionists voting Remain, 33% identifying as British, and 41% Protestant. Those figures have not changed. The shift that we've seen in recent times, which has attracted quite a lot of attention over the last few days, this idea that even within the North, we're moving towards support for a united Ireland. I think that's a soft unionist position of moving towards that. Those who don't necessarily vote in elections, it's worth remembering the turnout in Northern Ireland was low on Brexit referendum day, and it's been low at elections since. So it is possible that opinion is shifting, but not necessarily from voters who are dug in the trenches. But it needn't have been that way. In terms of a reinvigorated border, yeah, it is inevitable. And I think the most telling comment on the border was made by Theresa May, who, to her credit, did go to Northern Ireland and talk about the border in the Brexit referendum campaign, asking a question, her own question, that she still has not answered. In that interview with BBC Newsline, BBC Northern Ireland's Newsline programme, in 2016, she said, how can it be that a border can remain the same if one side is outside the European Union and the other is within? 2 years on, we're still waiting for that answer. And it's worth remembering the white paper did not talk about, the government's white paper in January, the first white paper that was issued, the government's position, where they offered these 12 propositions, negotiating propositions, just simply talks about a practical solution that keeps, I quote, a practical solution that keeps the border as seamless and frictionless as possible. It doesn't actually say that there won't be some kind of harder border. I prefer to use the term reinvigorated border, because borders are not just about cameras, they're not just about fences, they're also psychological. And whatever way we look at it, there will be a reinvigorated border on the island of Ireland. It will be more meaningful than it has been for the last 2 decades when it has been silent. Nationalists, certainly soft nationalists, not talking about militant Republicans, but nationalists accept in the short and medium term partition as a political fact, notwithstanding long-term ambitions for unity without question. They're not going to accept it as any sort of fence, whether it be technological or otherwise. And in terms of the potential security risk, again, I wouldn't exaggerate it, but in terms of getting security advice on Northern Ireland, where do you want to take it from? The Commissioner of the Guards? Maybe. The Chief Constable of the PSNI, George Hamilton? Or Jacob Rees-Mogg? I mean, there's a choice. And frankly, I would listen to the professionals in terms of the level of risk. Then there's the issue of why is that section of the unionist population seemingly impervious to the joys of the European Union, given the economic harm that they appear to have inflicted upon themselves? 29,000 farmers in Northern Ireland, 87% of their farm income coming from Europe. And yet opinion polls do show that a significant percentage of farmers, the percentage is disputed, but a significant percentage of farmers voted to leave the European Union. I think it's, again, a case of perceived sovereignty, control, whatever, trumping economic logic. And I agree with the points that were made earlier, that perhaps the referendum campaign should have been pitched upon people and personalities, people and personalities as much as the economic arguments. So, to finish off, where do we go from here? In terms of the parliamentary arithmetic, I don't think that there is a majority for a hard Brexit. I suspect that those 15 Lords' amendments that have been passed, that some of them will be very difficult to reverse. Yes, the Conservatives and the DUP will be joined by around a dozen, I would call them hard Brexiteers on the Labour side, people like Kate Hoey, people like Graham Stringer. So I don't underestimate the difficulties in terms of the parliamentary arithmetic. But I think that, notwithstanding what was said, that the customs union is not necessarily an answer. It's not a panacea because you need regulatory alignment. But it's probably the best that we can hope for. But I think that amendments in the Commons that demand continued membership of the customs union will survive. I think that does keep the ball in play for a greater re-entry into the European Union proper in due course by retaining membership of the customs union, because I think the illogicality of a position of being an EU rule taker without having any say will eventually be seen by the British public. And I think that that's why retention of the customs union, yes, it doesn't solve the border problem itself, but I think that it does buy some time in itself for a reversal of the decision, an overturning of the referendum, veering of the referendum at a later date. That's why I think the parliamentary arithmetic really does matter over the next year. Thanks very much.